All right, well, Happy New Year to all of you. I'm David Plank. I'm Executive Director of PACE, and I'm happy to welcome you to the first PACE Seminar of 2013. I'm particularly pleased to welcome you today for a couple of reasons. One is that something that rarely happened today, which is that the policy brief that Morgan wrote is in print as of today and released today, so that we have the policy brief coinciding with the seminar, which almost never happens. So if you didn't get a copy of the policy brief, please pick one up as you leave. The second is that those of you who are regular attendees of PACE seminars can notice that the room has been reorganized, and I think in general improved, although we've shifted the center of gravity a bit by putting extra seats in the front where no one likes to sit. So, but nevertheless, and AJ Block just told me that this is the very first use of this room, that this is the first event that's taken place in this room. As you know, we've been doing our seminars here for 10 years, so it's nice for us to be first. And the third reason is I get to introduce Morgan Polikoff. And one of the things that PACE does is we have a semi-annual meeting for reasons that are shrouded in mystery. We call it the Policy Research Panel. But a semi-annual meeting where we bring together many of the young policy scholars in California to introduce them to PACE, to talk about their research, and to talk about sort of the California policy environment, in the hope that we will recruit them into PACE's network and interest them in doing work on California. And Morgan has attended several meetings of that policy research panel, and is certainly a rising star in the field, and has committed a substantial share of his research attention to California. So it's really nice to have him here today. And with that, I'll just say that Morgan's an assistant professor in the Rasier School of Education at USC, and with interest generally in accountability standards and instruction. And I will hand it over to him.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me with that? Okay, so I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, David, for the nice introduction. I should say that this work is collaborative work with a former PhD student, now researcher at the University of Virginia named Andrew McCacken. He also does great work on California, and he's got some cool work about algebra that I think probably folks in this room will be really interested in. And I should also say, earlier this week I was in DC at another meeting of young scholars where we were talking about how to get your work to be seen by policymakers and to get policy relevant work actually out in the world. And so this is a real pleasure for me, because this is the sort of thing I want to do when I do policy relevant work. So today I'm going to talk about fixing the API, and I should say up front that I'm going to be fairly narrowly focused on API as a measure and on the design of API and its use for accountability purposes. So there's all kinds of great conversations to be had about expanding API to multiple measures, and I will touch on those, but that's not really the focus. So the focus is on the design of API. So I'm going to do a very brief history of background on API just to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of understanding the measure. Then I'm going to talk about 7 lessons learned from accountability research about the design of these kinds of performance indices. And I'll try and illustrate those where possible with figures and graphs that I think really drive home the points. Then I'm going to make 5 suggestions for improving API, and the goal in writing this was really to make suggestions that don't require a lot of new data collection, aren't going to be super onerous, but can really provide a lot of bang for your buck in terms of identifying schools that need improvement and identifying schools that are really doing well. And of course there's Q&A at the end, but I'm perfectly comfortable with you interrupting me if you have questions as I go along, particularly if I lapse into MCLB jargon or anything like that, which not everyone has the same background. So with that, let's talk about where API came from. So as probably most of you know, API came from the Public Schools Accountability Act of 1999. And California is one of the states, there are many states, that has a dual accountability system. So we've got PSAA and the API, and we also have No Child Left Behind and Adequate Yearly Progress. It's important that, even though PSAA doesn't really have the same kind of teeth that No Child Left Behind has, I think we all recognize that API is a very important value. I mean, realtors talk about API when people are looking at houses. Schools have banners where they have their API prominently on display. So even though it doesn't have the same kind of accountability punch that Adequate Yearly Progress does, API is a very important measure and it's widely discussed. And there's also evidence that schools actually respond to API even though there aren't these accountability sanctions. So work that my co-author Andrew has done has showed that middle schools actually make some decisions about whether or not to place kids in algebra in 8th grade and seemingly on the basis of API, because API and AYP have different incentives for placing kids in algebra or not. In addition to this historical origins of API, we have the recent movement, which I think really motivates this work, in the signing of SB 1458. So SB 1458 was a mandate to revise the API, and the requirement is that test scores will comprise no more than 60% of the API in high schools and no less than 60% of the API in elementary schools. And it's really talking about how to revise the API to include multiple measures to capture the performance of schools. And so with SB 1458, I think there's really a great opportunity right now to think about what kind of school performance evaluation system do we really want in this state? What are the outcomes of schools that are really important, and how can we measure those? And so we have a great opportunity now to revise the API. Briefly, how the API is calculated is that it is a weighted average of students' English language arts, math, science, and history CSTs, California Standards Test Scores. By far the greatest weight goes to English language arts and mathematics. Those two tests comprise 80 to 90% of the API calculation. There's also the high school use of CASE, which is included in the high school exit exam, is included in the API calculation. Each student's score on the CSTs are translated to a scale, and we've got the scale over here. I'm going to turn that off because that's a little bit irritating. And so, can folks in the back still hear me if I talk loud? Okay. So, so we have this performance index scale, and as you can see, one of the things you'll notice is that you get points all along the distribution of student achievement, but you get more points for moving kids up at the bottom of the distribution. And so the scores are weighted and averaged to form the school's API index, which is a number that goes from 200 to 1,000. And an interesting thing is that, so this might be a little bit of a touchy subject in Sacramento, but as you know, states are getting waivers from the No Child Left Behind Act. We were denied our waiver. But many states are moving to this kind of system. States that didn't have a measurement like this before, those states were using percent proficient instead. So the goal for API, the target for a school in a given year is an API of 800. If a school has an API of above 800, it just has to keep the API above 800. If a school has an API below 800, the goal is to close 5% of the gap between the school's current API and 800 in the next year. So for instance, a school with an API of 700 must increase its API to 705 in the next year in order to meet the standard. Schools also receive subgroup targets calculated in a similar way to the overall targets. And so what does this API of 800 actually mean in terms of proficiency? Because it's kind of a little bit unclear. So if all the students in a school were either proficient or basic, then an API of 800 is equivalent to about 57% of students being proficient. So this is actually a little bit lower of a target than we're at right now under No Child Left Behind's adequate yearly progress, where these days I think we're somewhere around 70-something%, and this year we have to be around 80-something% proficient. So the difference between API and AYP, well, under federal No Child Left Behind legislation, AYP is the primary measure of schools' performance. And AYP, unlike API, is based simply on the percent of students at or above proficient. So if you're 1 point below proficient, you count for 0. If you're 1 point above proficient, that's perfect. The percent of students required to be proficient is rapidly increasing, and by 2014, that target is going to be 100% of students proficient, since we were denied our waiver. And, but in point of fact, there are actually many loopholes to avoid this target of 100% proficiency, or this year it's 80-some% proficiency. And most notably in California, there's this provision called Safe Harbor. This actually is in all states, but it's used very widely in California. So it turns out that something like 80% of the Title I schools that are actually meeting AYP have proficiency rates that are below the target and are meeting it through this provision called Safe Harbor. And so these AYP targets are used to hold Title I schools accountable. There's a set of sanctions that go along with failing to meet AYP targets for 1, 2, 3, and so on years. And so AYP has more teeth, that's the point, because the results are actually used to hold schools accountable. So that's sort of the introduction, the overview of AYP and API. And so now I'm going to talk about some of the lessons learned from the accountability literature about the design of effective school rating systems and focus on API. And so I have 7 lessons learned that I'm going to touch on. They're listed here. I won't read them to you now because I'm going to go through them one at a time. So the first lesson learned is that API scores largely measure student demographics. And so what we have here is we have a scatter plot. Each dot is a school. And on the x-axis here we have the percent of students in the school that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And on the y-axis we have the school's API score. And so if you look at this figure, you can see there's a pretty clear relationship here. I mean, there's certainly some scatter about the line because not every school does exactly the same, but there's a pretty clear negative and linear relationship there. And in fact, the correlation here is between 0.5 and 0.6. And so, and furthermore, when we talk about other demographics, if all we know about a school is its demographics, its percent of students in poverty, its racial ethnic composition, we can do a remarkably good job telling you what its API score is going to be. In fact, we can explain more than 40% of the variation in API scores just by the demographics of the students. Now, the point here is not that API is uniquely bad in this regard. In fact, it's not really any worse than AYP is, than just measuring the percent proficient. But the point is, anytime you have a simple status measure of accountability, it's going to be very highly correlated with student characteristics because the vast majority of the variation in student achievement comes from outside of school factors. More than 70% comes from outside of school. So schools only affect a small amount, and so that's why you're seeing these correlations as high as they are. So, so if you use a measure, a status measure of accountability like this to rate schools, you're primarily rating schools on things that are outside of their control, which seems like probably not the most effective way to rate schools. Probably how you might rather rate schools is based on one of two things. Either how well they do relative to the inputs that they have, the student characteristics that they have, or how much progress they can help students make in a given year. And API as a status measure just doesn't really do either of those things. The second lesson that we have learned is that the change in API scores from year to year is highly unstable. And so why do we care about the change in API scores? Well, you'll remember that for schools that fall below the API target of 800, what matters is their change in API from year to year, right? A school with an API of 700 has to gain 5 points. Well, it turns out that the API scores from one year and the API scores from another year, from the subsequent year, are really not hardly related. So that's what we have here. We have this year's API growth change, so that's say 2010 to 2011, and last year's API change, so that's say from 2009 to 2010. And what you can see here is, again, you actually see a negative relationship. So what this means is that schools that grow in API this year are actually more likely than not to decline in API next year. And the correlation here is not big, it's negative 0.2, but nonetheless it's suggesting that change in API, which again is an important measure because it determines whether schools that are below 800 meet the standard or not, is a very unstable measure. And so again, this is not something that's new and exciting. Everyone knows that change scores are less reliable, well, not ever, but statisticians and methodologists know that change in measures is less reliable than the measures themselves. But the fact that this correlation is negative is actually interesting and sort of surprising, because in fact what we've seen, so one of the big hot button issues right now is value added for teachers. And people will say, well, value added for teachers is so unreliable. But in fact, the correlations there from year to year are positive, and they're like positive 0.3 or 0.4. So to have a negative relationship like this basically tells me that the change in API score from year to year isn't really measuring anything other than random noise. Do you have a question there?
If you look at all API scores, or just those subject to the increase of below 800?
Yeah, so the correlation's also negative 0.2 if you just look below 800, but this is all schools. But yeah, that's a good question. Because the schools that are above 800, it doesn't matter if they go up or down. And so, yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on that question too, which is not just the above or below 800 mark, but I'm wondering how different that would look if you were to look at schools with lower than a 500 API compared to those in the higher ranges, just because how much we have to do.
Yeah. I don't know that off the top of my head. My hunch is that this pattern holds true at all levels of API, but that's relatively easy, so I can certainly look into that. And so, particularly if you're going to do something like identifying the bottom performers or the top performers in a given year for some kind of, reward or some kind of sanction, and you were using a measure like this, that would be a really terrible idea, because the bottom performers in one year are almost, you can see, the bottom performers in this year, none of them are the bottom performers in next year. 0 of them, they're all up here. So it's not a measure that you would want to use to make those kinds of decisions. The third lesson that we have learned is that API appears to be biased against middle and high schools and in favor of elementary schools. So 45% of elementary schools had API scores below 800 in 2011, as compared to 58% of middle schools and 82% of high schools. And you can also see that in the means. Now, of course, it could be the case that high schools and middle schools are actually this much worse than elementary schools, and probably High schools maybe are a little bit worse than elementary schools on average, but it's probably unlikely that they're this much worse. And so there are a lot of reasons why this might be the case. One is that the tests used in the elementary grades in the API, the CSTs in the elementary grades, don't really measure proficiency on those tests. Doesn't indicate that you're going to go on to proficiency in higher levels, or that is, the proficiency cuts are not really calibrated that well across levels. That's one possibility. So the cut scores could be different, or the tests just aren't really measuring the right skills. But the point is that elementary schools are the places where we have the best opportunity to remedy these problems before they get serious. It's like, if a kid can't read by the time he gets to high school, it's really not a good thing. If it's, second or third grade, then there's a pretty good chance you can turn that around. So the fact that we're putting all of this accountability pressure on high schools and not really looking as much at elementary schools, I think doesn't really accurately reflect the quality of schools across grade bands. A fourth lesson is that growth in API, so again this year-to-year change, is, you might say it's biased against small schools, or you might say it's biased in favor of small schools, but certainly what you can see here, we have on the x-axis school enrollment, and on the y-axis we have the change in API score from one year to the next. And so what you can see is there's just tremendous amount of variance here in small schools. And again, this is a statistical property of that's a fact. But nonetheless, what we see is that small schools are overwhelmingly more likely to have the highest year-to-year changes as well as the lowest year-to-year changes. And so this is true, this is a well-known fact of the accountability literature. It's true for teachers if you're trying to evaluate teachers based on value added or change scores. If they have smaller classes, you get a greater amount of variation. So this is just a fact. And so the question is, what can you do about this? And I'll talk a little bit later about some suggestions for how you could deal with this. The fifth lesson is that API creates a disincentive to improve the achievement for high achievers. And in point of fact, this was almost surely an intentional decision on the part of the folks who wrote the PSAA policy. But if you remember back a few slides ago, when I showed you the scale points, you can see that if a school's thinking about, boy, how do I raise my API score? I've got to raise my API score 5 points. Where do you think they're going to target? Well, they're going to target down here because you get 300 points for moving a kid from far below basic to below basic, but you only get 125 points for moving a kid from proficient to advanced. And in fact, you get no points at all once a kid's already advanced, right? You can't raise his achievement anymore because there's nothing above advanced. So there's no incentive to do so for these schools that are below 800. And so another way to see this is to think about a school where we have 1,000 students, and we have 20% of those students in each of our 5 categories, so from far below basic all the way up to advanced. So this school would have an API of 655. And so the goal for the next year would be to raise API by 8 points. And so what we see in this bar graph is how many students you have to move across each of these levels in order to get those 8 points. So you can see, if you're moving kids from far below basic to below basic, you only have to move about 26 of them. In contrast, if you're trying to move kids from proficient to advanced, you have to move 62 of them. So again, which of these, what incentive do we have here for schools? We have incentive to focus on low achievers, and of course we want to raise the achievement of low achievers, there's no question about that, but we also don't want to neglect high achievers, and the system creates an incentive to focus more on low achievers and less on high achievers. And there's a good deal of accountability literature that shows that schools respond to these incentives. And that, for instance, there's that whole literature on the bubble kids, right? Under AYP, the kids who are just below the proficient cut score, schools focus a lot of attention and resources on them. So it's almost certain that we see the same kinds of things in a system like this that doesn't really reward you very much once you get to high achievement. The sixth lesson, and probably the most important lesson, so I don't know why I didn't put it first, is that API does not track the achievement of individual students. API is based on cohorts of students who change over time, right? It's different kids. You're comparing different kids from year to year. And so let's imagine a school. Say it's a middle school with grades 6, 7, and 8. And let's imagine this is a phenomenally effective school. It's a school that, on average, its kids come in at the 30th percentile of achievement. And this school raises those kids' achievement to the 50th percentile by grade 7 and to the 80th percentile by grade 8. So it's improving these kids' achievement by 20 percentile points per year. Unbelievably, phenomenally effective school. Well, it turns out that this school looks like an average school. And in fact, it doesn't change over time what the score is. So even though the school is very effective at raising achievement, the average here is right in the middle of the distribution and is not changing over time. This school, based on this calculation, which is just like the API calculation, this school looks like a completely average school, when in fact it's almost certainly not. And so why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem for this reason that I just illustrated, but it's also sort of conceptually a problem because we know that student demographics in schools can change from year to year. When you take out a bunch of 8th graders and you put in a bunch of 6th graders, things could have happened. These could be totally different kids, and it's not really appropriate. It's not even appropriate to compare them. And so what we can't do using API is actually measure the school's impact on student achievement, which probably, again, is what we really want to measure because we want to be rewarding or sanctioning or even just talking about schools' performance in terms of the context of things they can actually control. And impact on student achievement is something you can actually control, and this system just doesn't reward that. And some people are all concerned there are all these technical issues like, well, you don't have a vertical scale, so you can't compare 5th graders to 6th graders because the scale of the test differs. But even without a vertical scale, there are plenty of ways to measure growth, and I could certainly get more technical. There are all kinds of value-added experts who you could bring in who would talk your ear off about how you can measure growth without a vertical scale. And so those technical issues shouldn't get in the way of measuring school performance in the way that really makes the most sense. And then the last point, which probably actually is the second most important point, so I'm not sure why I made it the last point, is that API focuses too narrowly on student achievement measured by standardized tests. And I say this after I've spent the last 6 slides talking about student achievement measured by standardized tests. So while we can all, well, maybe we can't all agree, but we probably should all agree that standardized tests actually do predict future life success. So there was this big front page article in the New York Times about this study by Raj Chetty and his colleagues at Harvard that showed, that getting a more effective teacher had these tremendous impacts later on, hundreds of thousands of dollars in career earnings for a classroom of students. So, and how we determined who was an effective teacher was based on their value added to student achievement, based on test scores only. I think we can also all agree that there are many other potentially important outcomes that we want to measure. And SB 1458 gives us the opportunity to include more measures. And so, what might these measures include? Well, I think graduation, that's obviously going to be an important part. But there are things that go beyond graduation. Enrollment and persistence in higher education, or college readiness if you don't want to go that far. Students' actual employment. students' social well-being. You know, how happy are they? How safe do they feel in school? Students' civic participation or students' engagement in the classroom. These are all measures that I think you know, effective schools will help improve outcomes on these measures. And so if you think that something is important, then probably you should include it in your accountability system and measure it, because as we all know, by narrowly focusing on standardized tests, which is what API and AYP have done, that's what we've gotten in the classroom. We've gotten a narrowing of focus on the subjects that are tested, and there's a lot of reasons why that might not be a good thing. So the more a broad picture of a school's performance you can get from including multiple measures, the better. So I've talked about 7 lessons that we've learned, and now I'm going to offer 5 solutions that I think follow quite directly from the lessons. And again, the purpose here was to think about ways to improve API without like going overboard in terms of tons of new data collection and everything like that. So certainly if you wanted to be really ambitious, you could create tons of new measures, and you can measure every school on 10 different dimensions, and there could be utility to that. But here I'm focusing mostly on the test-based measures, and then I'll talk about how we need other measures as well. So the absolute most important feature that needs to be changed to have an effective school performance system is you must be able to track the performance of individual students. And so, California doesn't need to reinvent the wheel on this issue. There are tons of states and districts that are already using sophisticated methods for analyzing longitudinal student level data. You've got Colorado has the student growth percentiles. A lot of states started using these growth measures because of Race to the Top or the No Child Left Behind waivers. And so there's a really, by now, very robust literature on how to do value-added modeling, what are the problems, what are the alternatives. You've got value-added modeling experts within the state and outside the state. I do not count myself as a value-added modeling expert, but I know sort of just enough about value-added modeling to be dangerous. And the point is that you don't have to use these. So everyone's all concerned, oh, we have value-added, it's going to be used to evaluate teachers, and it's going to be punitive. Well, you don't have to use value-added for accountability purposes for individual educators, or even for accountability purposes for schools if that's undesirable. It's nonetheless useful to understand what the contribution is of a particular school to students' learning, and we can't do that right now at all with API. We also have longitudinal data systems already in place, although I don't know so much about the quality of those longitudinal data systems. And the smarter balanced assessments that California is signed up for should in principle help, because they're supposed to have a vertical scale. They're going to be computer adaptive, so they'll be better at measuring students at the top and the bottom of the distribution. And so, the time is really ripe to start using this kind of measure. But of course, I've just said that growth measures are really not so stable, and so one way that we can improve the stability of these growth measures is to use multiple years of data. And so in our brief, which is based on a paper that is published in an academic journal, we show that by moving from a growth model from a 1-year average to a 3-year average, you can really dramatically improve the reliability of these measures. That you can, if you combine growth measures of achievement with levels of achievement, again, that improves the reliability. And again, the point is here that there's a robust literature that we can draw on. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. And there's experts in the state who can help advise the creation of such a system. The third suggestion is to use both growth in achievement and levels of achievement to identify interventions tailored to schools. And so what I have here is a very crude system that one could use, and you could get certainly much more sophisticated than this. But rather than sort of taking these two measures that measure different things and kind of cramming them into one index, I think it makes much more sense to have multiple indices. And so, you know, you can also add to this the other things that you're measuring, graduation rates, student engagement, et cetera, to get really a profile of school performance. So what I have here, this is a very crude picture, is we've got API level. All right, so these are high achieving schools on the right, meaning they have an API 800, 900. And then I have API growth. So these are high growing schools. And here I'm not talking about API growth as we're currently thinking about it. I'm talking about a better growth model like the one I just proposed. And so you can think about, well, what kind of schools are in these different cells and how might we want to help those schools, or maybe they don't need help. So the first box up here, these are schools that are high growing and high performing. So these are like the absolute high flyers. I think that probably what we would say is that these schools don't need much additional support, if any additional support. Rather, what we could do is we could use them as models for other schools. And we might also free them from some of the sort of bureaucratic accountability stuff that they probably don't need because they're doing so well. Another group is here. So we have, these are schools that are low performing but consistently high growing, that is, growing over a period of years. And so what might we say about these schools? Well, again, probably, even though these schools have relatively low levels, it looks like over time they're really improving. So what would we want to do? We probably would want to sort of step back and say, you guys look like you're doing the right thing. Let's let you continue to do it. Again, these schools might be models for, say, schools down here, right? So these are schools that are really making a lot of progress, even though they have, poorer inputs. And so again, we probably want to free them from, under AYP, these schools are being held accountable, right? And under API, because they're low performing. But probably that doesn't make too much sense, because actually it looks like they're improving over time. So why would we be, bothering them? Really, we should be letting them continue to improve. And then down here, it sort of gets a little tricky. So here you've got high achieving, but low growing schools. So these are schools that, have really good inputs, but for one reason or another, those kids don't seem to be actually progressing that much. And so, these schools could probably be models to these schools. And we, this probably isn't such a huge problem unless the growth turns really bad and they start sort of drifting this way. But this, I think, is actually sort of politically the trickiest box, because, if this is Beverly Hills High School and you're trying to go in and tell them what to do, then I think that probably will create some problems. And then over here we've got the true low performers, which are low levels and low growth. And these are really the ones we absolutely want to focus on, trying to help them improve using research-based interventions. And so I think that what this framework adds is sort of a more nuanced picture of school performance than we get from the extremely blunt API or AYP measure that basically just dichotomizes schools along this axis. Yeah?
Could you clarify what you mean by growth? That school you said before that went from 30% of the kids to 70%, that's growth.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't be growing in their growth. I mean,
right. Yeah.
So you're talking about the first kind, which is they are getting kids to grow each year.
Right, and that kind of growth would show up under a model that actually tracked individual students. So if you did a value-added,
kids, but they are significantly growing.
Right, the kids themselves are actually growing, and that would show up under a value-added model, but it doesn't show up under this change in API. That was the point of that slide, which I don't think I stated too clearly. So when I say growing, I mean the kids are growing. Because right now, change in API from year to year doesn't really tell you anything at all about what the kids are doing.
How do you currently does with its similar school rankings?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's a good question. So, in a similar schools ranking, basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, basically you're clustering schools in terms of, you know, they look like other schools, and then you're saying which ones have higher achievement and which ones have lower achievement. And probably you're going to get roughly similar kinds of classifications between this kind of system and that kind of system, but that system, again, doesn't talk about actually growth. It talks about achievement relative to demographics. So it's not exactly the same thing. I think that you actually get a clearer picture in this kind of system than that kind of system. But like I said, I think probably they're going to identify some similar kinds of students. So the fourth suggestion is to administer accountability separately by school level and size. And so, as we already know from SB 1458, the different school levels are going to have different measures to go into their API. And so it makes sense anyway to have those two systems be different. But this is very easy to accomplish through stratification. So for instance, if you say, you know, we're focused on the bottom 5% of schools. In general, I don't like those kind of bottom X%, but let's just say that's what you wanted to do. Then say, pick the bottom 5% of elementary, the bottom 5% of middle, and the bottom 5% of high schools. Rather than what we do now, so if you did that now, what would you get? You'd probably get like, you know, 10% of high schools, 5% of middle schools, and 2% of elementary schools. Because again, these measures are biased against high schools. And you might also, so this also goes back to sort of similar schools, but you might also identify the bottom X% by school size. So you might say separate school size into chunks, right? So you might say like, you know, below 200, 200 to 400, et cetera, and then you might choose from within those chunks. And that way it's going to be fairer across the full range of the distribution. You can also adjust scores sort of statistically using shrinkage techniques to account for the statistical fact that they sort of have a greater variance if they're smaller schools. And so the point is that if you do something like this, it's just much fairer to elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, and to smaller schools and bigger schools than is the case right now. And then the last suggestion is to explore alternative measures of school performance. And I really sort of already talked about this, but I kind of want to emphasize it again. You know, people talk all the time about, you know, the importance of things like creativity and students' entrepreneurship. And they say things like, well, you know, standards and accountability are destroying the creativity of our students, or teaching to the test is causing all these negative consequences. But no one's actually measuring those things. And so, you know, if those are things that we value, I mean, first of all, we need to have a discussion about what it is that we value and what we want the outcomes of schools to be. But if those are things that we value, then we should include those in our evaluation of how a school is doing. I mean, rather than just saying that this is a problem and then not doing anything about it. I mean, the simple fact from all the literature that we know about testing and accountability is that you get what you test. And so right now we're testing math and English achievement, basically. I mean, we do a little bit of other stuff, you know, history is 7%. But really what we're saying to teachers and to schools is all we care about is math and reading achievement. So if we instead said, you know, we care about math and reading achievement, that's a third of what we care about. And we care about student engagement and parent participation, that's 20% of what we care about. And we care about, you know, student entrepreneurship, that's 10% of what we care about, right? If we had all of those things and we could create this picture of how a school was doing along all of the dimensions that we actually care about, I think that that would, I mean, first of all, it would move California ahead of all other states, because no state's doing anything like that. But second of all, I think it really sort of puts our money where our mouth is and really gets us much closer to the kind of school that we say we want. And of course, some of these measures are going to require new data collection, and you could talk about sort of clever ways to do the data collection to minimize the cost. Other of these measures are not going to require new data collection. But I think we need to have this discussion, and we need to come to some sort of agreement about what are the desired outcomes of school, and then how can we construct our school evaluation system to really align very well with those measures and sort of provide consistent messages about what we want. And so, to wrap up, the points I want to make are, API has served a useful purpose. I mean, as we see, people focus very much on API, and people say what they will. I think that the standards and accountability movement has changed schools in a pretty remarkable way, and depends who you ask, but I think they've been changed somewhat for the better. Now, there's all kinds of bad things that have happened too, and some of those were very foreseeable by the design of these systems. So one of the points that I'm trying to make is that when you think about how to design a system, you should think about what are the incentives that you're creating, and how can you design a system that is going to minimize all the bad things that you don't want to happen, and maximize all the good things that you think should happen. And so this means starting with a discussion about what we want to measure, then measuring it, and then sort of using those results to drive improvement. And so I think that fixing the API on its own is not going to solve any of our problems, but I think that certainly a revised API that includes multiple measures and is more thoughtful about measuring growth can go really a long way toward improving education in California. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to answer questions. I don't know if David wants to moderate or anything like that.
I won't moderate, but I'll call on. Yes, in the back.
I know that most of these issues, except maybe number 4, I'm not sure about, I know the other 4 suggestions have all been talked about for a fairly long time in the Department of Education.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what kind of extra thing can you bring to this discussion that actually push them forward to actually get something done if they need to change?
Well,
You can do
put
seminars,
your second one on board. That's like the hardest. Yeah.
publish policy briefs. So, we got some levers here.
Well, that's probably the hardest question I've ever been asked. I mean, listen, I think that we have a good opportunity right now for a number of reasons. There's momentum in the state. The governor is on board. We have a legislature that is, that we've got supermajorities in both houses, and so there's an opportunity from that standpoint. We're at a decade now a little over a decade now of standards-based reform. We've learned a lot, and I think that this literature and what we know is really at a mature state, and we can really offer really good advice. I think that fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, but so we were turned down for the waiver, but there's certainly the possibility that there could be some kind of reauthorization or some kind of waiver that could happen. I mean, of course, there's this tension about teacher evaluation, which probably isn't going to go away. But the point is that there's kind of a lot of things coming together that give us a better chance of getting this sort of thing done than we have before. With NCLB still in place, doing these kinds of things probably aren't going to change that much. So really, I think the thing is we need to get out from under NCLB. And so to the extent that, the governor and the superintendent can find some way to do that without giving in on all their principles, I think would be useful. Otherwise, if we're stuck under NCLB, you can make all these changes that you want, but you're still going to have 80-90% of schools failing. So I think that part's kind of tough. I mean, it's a political question, and you know, I'm an assistant professor, so.
Other questions for Morgan?
Currently, the state ranks schools, reduces all these numbers down to a single rank, and part of the new legislation is about getting rid of that. But can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on the usefulness or perniciousness of that system?
Well, I mean, there are good things and bad things about ranks. I mean, so you know, when you've got this threshold, API is 800, and so that's sort of a criterion reference threshold, right? So we want schools to be above 800, and then we say they're good enough, or below 800, and they're not good enough. And so there are advantages to having a clear, right, expectation. It doesn't pit schools against one another. When you've got a ranking system, then obviously that does pit schools against each other, because if one school improves, then I look worse. I mean, I think that my big problem with the ranking system, particularly if a ranking system is also used in combination with something like, you know, the bottom 5% of schools get X intervention, or I mean, we could have all schools being good, right? All schools could be improving, and we still have to identify. I mean, I don't think that all schools are, but and then we'd still have to be identifying them. So I don't think it quite matches with our vision, which is sort of all schools improving. Probably what I would, you know, so I think that's the advantage of these kind of profiles, right? If you've got multiple measures in a profile, then, I mean, yes, schools are going to be ranked against each other on some of the profiles, but what you can see is if they look like they're low on a lot of these measures, then that looks like something that you might want to do something about. And if it looks like they're low on one measure but high on other measures, then, you know, so I think that when you've got one measure in your ranking, that can be a problem. When you've got multiple measures in your ranking on all of them, that's probably less of a problem. Probably more actually informative.
Yeah.
This might be a little bit broader of a question, but so many teachers are already used to API standards and kind of teaching to fit these specific testing measurements. How do you think your suggestions would affect credentialing programs and just methods that teachers are using in the classroom?
Well, I mean, so that's another good question. I mean, I think that right now, as far as I know, there's no talk about any kind of accountability for teachers in California. I mean, there is in some districts like LAUSD. But as a general rule across the state, the governor said he's opposed to that. So that sounds like it's not going to happen. So without those kind of teeth, I don't think that it's going to be quite as much of an impact. But nonetheless, I think, you know, I mean, you could go through point by point and you could say how you think it might influence teachers. So for instance, focusing on growth of all students, right, as opposed to, say, API, which has this weird scale that causes incentives to focus on low achievers. I think that might help teachers focus on all students, you know, more on all students. That's sort of one idea. I mean, I think that probably what matters more is California's adopted the Common Core standards. We're moving to these smarter balanced assessments, which are going to be sort of a different form. What I think is going to matter in terms of influencing what teachers do is how we support teachers to implement those standards. You know, what kind of curriculum materials do they get? What kind of training do they get? I think that revising the API system probably on its own wouldn't have that much of an influence on what teachers are doing. I think it's more about sort of content and the assessment. Those kinds of pieces really would influence what teachers are doing.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Morgan. Could you, from a place of equity, could you give a little more insight about where your solutions, your proposed solutions, have an impact on the students who are furthest behind, and how your solutions posit movement towards eliminating opportunity and achievement disparities? And then on the back end of that, sometimes averages can mask inequities when we look at it from a statistical perspective. how would we still hold schools accountable for that if we excluded getting from under NCLB? So it's kind of a two-part
Yeah.
question. If you could give some voice to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I mean, so what I talked about was I was talking about API as like a total score, but you
Right.
can still certainly, so right now I'm hypothesizing a world where NCLB doesn't exist anymore and California gets to decide its own accountability
It's a
system.
beautiful dream world.
So you could still have subgroup measures of API, right? You could report API at the subgroup level. You could have, when I talk about sort of, when I talk about the, this, so you could have a profile for all students, right? And you could also have a profile for your various subgroups, right? Socioeconomic disadvantage, Black, Latino, whatever subgroups you want to have. And I'm absolutely all for those because I think that there's no question that those kinds of subgroup measures get schools to pay attention to those groups more than they otherwise would have. What I think that we don't want to do is have a system like we currently have that really creates no incentive at all to focus on high achievers, folks who are already doing well. And, because I mean, they're important too, high achievers are important too. I mean, if you talk, not that high achievers are the only people who are going to be creating jobs, but high achievers, go on. It's important, we want to keep them high achievers, right? We don't want to hold them down because our system is only focused on low achievers. So I think
they test well, so I think that you have to be careful in discerning in how you define high achievers. They test well based upon the
that's what I'm
knowledge
defining high achiever as,
Right.
is they test well.
Just to clarify.
Those were synonymous in what I was saying. But they might have, yes, there are other components of high achievers. But the point is that by having, so if you've got this kind of picture for all students and you've got it for your low-income students and you've got it for your ELL students, then what you can really see is you can see a picture of schools' performance. And I think, what you might see is for ELL students, you might, in a certain school, you might see, well, they have really low scores, but they're growing a lot. Again, that's not something we can see under the current system. So I think there's just advantages to going to this kind of system, even while I still support disaggregation and we could talk about how you would use these things to hold schools or to hold teachers or to hold administrators accountable.
Yeah, far back.
Yes, a couple technical questions. You mentioned multiple indices. Would you envision that you would consider multiple indices in various measures and then create a composite score? Or would you want to keep it separate? And then the second question would be, let's say we put in the new assessments, the new multiple measures, would we then start from ground zero on our scale and have everybody begin at the beginning? Or would we use our current system and just modify it?
So on the first one, I mean, I think that people make a mistake when they take a bunch of weird measures and they cram them together to give you a composite score. Like, that's what we do with like U.S. News and World Report rankings, and that's not really as useful. The composite score provides some value, but what also provides value is seeing the profile of performance. So, I think about this in the same way that I think about measuring teacher performance. And so I just came from a meeting where we were talking about measuring teacher performance using value-added scores, using student surveys, using observations. You could talk about other instruments. And so I think about it in the same way. You could even have a picture where you've got like a composite score at the top. You've got each of your measures, and you can see where you are on each of your measures as well as the composite, because I think that really helps drive improvement much more. You can see where you're coming up short. For the second question, we're in sort of we're in kind of a bad place right now because we're rolling out these smarter balanced assessments in a couple of years, and we're making decisions right now about what kind of testing we're going to, earlier this week they decided, they're going to change what tests, or they said they want to change what kind of tests they're administering in schools. So, I don't think it's a bad thing to wait for a couple years to roll these things out. I think it's going to be really all kinds of confusing for schools in the interim. probably, you know, if you wanted to get Arnie Duncan to sign off on a waiver, you'd have to say we're going to use them in the next couple of years. But I think a little bit of caution and sort of rollout is useful rather than, you know, glomming it onto the existing system and then immediately attaching punitive sanctions to it.
Any further questions? If not, thanks again to Morgan.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming, and see you next month.